So, the revolution that we're doing today is a little bit different from last chapter's revolutions, where last chapter's revolutions were political revolutions, and a lot of them also had a very social outcome. So, with some of them, there was almost a social revolution component to it. The revolution that we're dealing with this chapter is going to be an economic revolution. It's going to be a production revolution. And that, just like the other revolutions, will have very much a social connection to them. And with the introduction here, we're going to start with Gandhi criticizing industrialization as economic exploitation. This note or this area will kind of be dealing with off and on for the rest of the year. The question of the exploitative nature of industrialization, especially um, in the working class, but also once we start to expand into the next two chapters, chapter 18, chapter 19, then the industrialization is going to have a new type of exploitation when it comes to imperialism and the people that it's going to force to produce for it in one way or another. But in general, every kind of society has embraced at least the idea of industrialization since it started in Great Britain in the late 18th century. The Industrial Revolution, honestly, was one of the most significant elements of Europe's modern transformation. I mean, this is going to change the face of the Western world, not just simply Europe, but also the United States when it arrives, and later on in other areas when it arrives, usually as a consequence of imperialism that we'll talk about in chapter 18 and 19. The initial industrialization period was from 1750 to 1900, although you do want to put down here next to number one, just want to put that it came in two phases. It came in two phases. You'll see that the initial phase, it really is the all England show. The second phase is going to be defined by industrialization reaching to other areas, in particular the United States, Germany, and some other areas in continental Europe. But whenever this industrialization comes, whether it's from the first phase or the second phase, it's going to utterly transform European society. It's here that this economic revolution, or this production revolution, is also going to kind of lop over into being a social revolution because things are going to be almost day and night type of change where we've kind of had been consistent since the very beginning of the year when we talked about the Renaissance and even a little bit touching on the Middle Ages and the agricultural revolution, that people's lives have pretty much been the same. You know, there's been some relative changes, but the vast majority of people are working in agriculture. And with the exception of some tweaks here and there between the agricultural revolution and the dawn of the industrial revolution, things pretty much have stayed the same. However, life from 1675 to 1775 in the course of a century is going to be day and night difference, even from 1750 to 1850. It's going to be almost unidentifiable with the types of changes that are going on. And this industrialization is also what pushes Europe into a position of global dominance. Like I've been telling you, up to basically this chapter, Europe has been several steps behind the other civilizations, whether it's China, whether it's the Islamic civilizations, it doesn't matter. Europe has been desperately trying to play catch up. And by 1750, give or take a little bit, the Europeans have finally started to catch up. Now, with industrialization, because they're the civilization that will have the capacity to industrialize and no one else does, these guys are going to finally come into their own period of dominance. And it is going to be more fundamental than any breakthrough since the agricultural revolution. This is going to be a complete and total game changer. But the interesting and almost ironic thing is, you want to put this down here next to number five, but we need to have changes in agriculture to free people to work in industry. But we need to have changes in agriculture to free people to work in industry. It's not going to be until we're able to make agriculture, farming, as efficient as humanly possible, where we don't need everyone's labor in order to farm, in order to create enough food to sustain the population. Once we have those technological breakthroughs and we have labor saving devices and more efficient means of farming and also different types of crops that we'll talk about a little bit later, we don't need as many people to farm. So then these extra people that we don't need to perform some type of agricultural labor, we're going to be able to turn them into the first generation of industrial laborers. The origins of the Industrial Revolution are going to lay in two kind of interesting areas. One is going to be in population growth, and another is going to be in an energy crisis. We have the development of non renewable fossil fuels for energy, especially in this first phase. It's going to be predominantly coal. The second phase, it's going to be oil, electricity, that type of thing. And because of this energy crisis, and also honestly because of the population growth, we're going to have a mounting impact on the environment, not just simply because of the coal, for example, that we're going to be ripping out of the earth, but also there's a big environmental impact because of the growing numbers of people. In fact, from 1750 to 1914, the population rather of Europe is going to more than triple. And so again, like we said, this impact is going to be the extraction of raw material. Sewers are also going to empty industrial waste into the environment, and smoke is going to pollute the air. You want to put like a little carrot, put like one of those little carrots right here, and then we're going to put a note right at the end of this carrot. Actually, put a star by it and then put the note that these impacted living conditions. These impacted living conditions. The Industrial Revolution also brought an enormous increase rather in the output of goods and services. We are finally able to start to produce things in mass quantities. And again, a lot of this is a reaction to the population boom. Because remember, if we have more people, those more people have more needs. And the old school way of production, using something known as the cottage system or the domestic system, isn't able to fulfill those people's needs. So before 1750, 1800, the major Eurasian civilizations were about equal technologically. This is going to be before the Industrial Revolution really kicks off, and Europe and China and the Islamic empires, like the Ottomans and the Mughals, they're all pretty much at the same level, give or take a little bit. Because remember, China has sealed itself off and they're not really growing, they've kind of stagnated. And the Islamic empires have kind of had a little bit of a flat line as well. The greatest breakthrough here for this industrial revolution is going to be with the steam engine, which soon is going to spread to the textile industry and many other types of production. Agriculture here is also going to be transformed. So, even though the biggest change is going to be in industry, some of those industrial inventions will be manipulated and introduced to the agricultural world, going and making it even more efficient to where we need even less people to farm and we're able to produce even more food as well. Eventually, here, this technology will spread from Britain to Western Europe and then on to the United States, Russia, although Russia's a little bit of a question mark, to be honest with you. They'll be industrialized, but you really also want to kind of put it in quotes. And eventually Japan. will also become industrialized as well. Although Japan, it's going to be a much more purposeful adaptation rather than any type of an organic adaptation. And in the 20th century, industrial revolution or industrialization is going to become global. And a lot of that, of course, is going to have to do with imperialism that we will see in the 19th century, but definitely we're going to kind of go pro level when it comes to the 20th century. So we have a little bit of a historical scholars, a historian's throwdown, where many have debated why industrialization first appears in Great Britain and why it started in the late 20th century. Now, the old school way is that some have argued that there's something inherently unique about European society that will explain this development. In fact, as you want to put down here next to number two, just put in parentheses older view. Some early historians kind of just make the case that there's something exceptional about Europe, that there's something that they have or that Western civilization in general has that allowed them to industrialize and sort of kind of, hosed everybody else over, that everybody else was kind of lacking this. And this view has been challenged by, a couple different things. One, the fact that other parts of the world have had great technological and scientific flourishing. And in fact, you want to put down here next to 3A, just put down Europe had only recently caught up. Europe had only recently caught up. I mean, like I've said before, up until 1750, Europe is kind of chasing after these other civilizations. These other civilizations have had great periods of time or great times of significant technological and scientific growth. This is just simply Europe's time. And it doesn't necessarily make them any type of special, doesn't make them unique in any type of way. And also, part of this is the fact that Europe did not enjoy any type of overall economic advantage as late as 1750. I mean, at best in 1750, the Europeans are only just catching up to the Chinese, to the Ottomans, to the Mughals. So, more current, more contemporary historians tend to see the Industrial Revolution as a rather quick and unexpected eruption in the period 1750 to 1850. And there's a couple reasons as to why this might have occurred in Europe. And you want to put a star here by number 5. And we do have notes that will go with A and also that will go with B. So again, as usual, you might want to go one side for one and the other side for the other. You do you as usual. Some patterns of European internal growth are going to favor innovation. The big one here, and this is what I need you to put down here next to A, because this is something that we've been dealing with since day one. Do you want to put that they are small and highly competitive states? They are small and highly competitive states. So there is this obsession with trying to be better than your next door neighbor in Europe. So as soon as one country has something or is able to do something, their next door neighbor is going to strive to do the exact same thing or to have the exact same thing. And these other places aren't necessarily that type of competitive. They're not broken up in the same way that in particular the Western European nations are broken up. Some European rulers also had a very unusual alliance with the merchant class. In part, you want to put down here next to B that merchants give the government something in return. Merchants give the government something in return. So, for a good part of English history during this time, for example, the government and the merchants, the business classes, are going to have a very cooperative relationship. The government will kind of make policies to ensure that these business classes have a lot of advantages. And in return, these business classes are going to be a source of wealth for the government, especially through taxation, earlier through charters, and through other, for lack of a better idea, almost through other interest groups as well. So it's sort of kind of like, one scratches the other one's back, and then, the roles end up going ahead and reversing. Other areas did develop market-based economies by the 18th century. Really great example of these are Japan, China, and India. But Europe was at the center of this most varied exchange network. Remember, we kind of have spent the last couple chapters here prior to the French Revolution building up these colonial connections. Well, with industrialization, these connections are going to go to another level. And the contact with these culturally different people are going to encourage change, and also they're going to encourage innovation. Again, because we've had these long-term contacts with civilizations that, to be honest with you, have their stuff more together than the Europeans up to this point, the Europeans will utilize some of that knowledge. They'll tweak it to suit whatever situation that they have at home and then kind of run forward with it. So there's opportunities that the Europeans have that these other countries just simply, or these other civilizations just simply don't at this point. So the next issue, besides why Europe in general, is going to be why Britain specifically. The Industrial Revolution does begin on this little island in the northern part of the Atlantic. And there's a couple reasons for this. And I'm going to warn you right now that there is kind of a beastie note that goes with A, because we have to define the enclosure movement. But you should be able to run it down the side because the other notes on this page are relatively small. So, just a little bit of a heads up there. But the big start is that Britain was the most commercialized of Europe's larger countries. So here's the deal. Just in case you didn't realize, Britain's an island. Okay. And it is incapable of producing absolutely every single thing that it needs. And it also cannot consume everything that it does produce. So, because it's an island, it very quickly becomes linked to these trade networks. Not only is these trade networks in continental Europe, but also in the New World. We're going to see them creating trade networks in India and Africa throughout this entire period because of the commercial need that England has. And again, a lot of that just simply goes and rests on the fact that it's an island. And you'll see that in a later chapter, there's going to be some parallels here with Japan. That because they're an island, because they're isolated, they become highly dependent upon trade to sustain themselves. And England is going to be part of that. One of the other parts of this is that small farmers have been pushed out in something known as the enclosure movement. So I want to kind of define this for you a little bit. You want to go ahead and draw a line underneath the enclosure movement, and then you want to put this note, and again, it's a good size note over here along the side, because I want to kind of give you a little bit of context and give you a little bit of the outcomes of the enclosure movement. But you want to put, please, that this took away common land and allowed large landowners to use more efficient technology, which put small farmers out of work, caused them to move to the city, and become the first generation of industrialized workers. So we kind of have a little bit of good news, bad news with the enclosure movement. So The bad news is that we're going to take common land, land that peasants for generations have been able to farm on for themselves, have been able to release their animals to feed off of the stubble or the grass or whatever to feed their herd animals. And the nobles are going to take this and they're going to start to fence it in. They're going to start to enclose it. Once this enclosure occurs, these large landowners, because they have the wealth to do this, they're able to start to use labor saving devices on that land. So, bad news is going to be that we don't need as many farmers. So, those farmers are going to be displaced. They're going to end up having to move to the city for any hope of finding a job, and they'll ultimately become the first generation of industrial workers. Now, the good news is that one, this will help to kick off the Industrial Revolution. The other part of the good news is that it will increase the amount of food that is available. And remember, if we have more of something, it's going to make that something less. So give it a little bit of time. Food prices will go down. Other prices that are associated with food will go down. And these workers whose lives are, understandably harsh, will slowly start to improve as these low food prices kind of start to trickle out into other parts of life. There is linked to this because of Britain. There's a ready supply of industrial workers with just a few options. You want to put down here next to number 2 that these are the displaced farm workers. These are the displaced farm workers. You also have British aristocrats being interested in commerce. You also then want to put down here next to number 3 that they're willing to take on economic risks. They're willing to take on economic risks. What this means is that we have the people with money who are willing to take that money and invest it into other economic ventures. So, this very first phase of the Industrial Revolution is going to be these wealthy English landowners, these wealthy British aristocrats who are going to be investing in these economic opportunities. They're going to be investing in various and sundry coal mines. They're going to be investing in factories. They're going to be investing in overseas companies in order to get the raw materials in order to industrialize. And the thing is that we don't have this in any of the other European countries at this time for a variety of reasons that we really don't necessarily need to get into. British commerce, of course, is going to be worldwide. Again, it's the most commercialized of the European countries. We have trade connections globally. This is going to be really what the English are going to build up during that period of colonization. And it's what they're going to go pro with during the period of imperialism that we're going to deal with in chapter 18 and 19. You also, the British political life encouraged commercialization and economic innovation. You want to put down here next to number 5 that the government fostered and protected the changes going on. The government fostered and protected the changes going on. And the reason for this is because these British aristocrats who are interested in money making opportunities are also the ones who made up the members of the British government. So they're going to want to make sure that there is a situation in which their investment is going to pay off. And then, guys, you want to drop down the page here a little bit. Britain has a lot of natural resources like coal and iron ore that are very conveniently located. Spoiler alert, um, the United States and Germany will have a greater amount, but they're at a little bit deeper level. They're not necessarily quite as conveniently located. But once we develop the technology to be able to efficiently mine in the United States and Germany, that's going to be one of the reasons why those two areas in the second half of the Industrial Revolution are going to really take off. Britain also was not devastated by the Napoleonic Wars. The thing about being an island is that you can choose to participate in the nonsense that's going on in the continent or just simply stay on your little island. And because Napoleon was never able to invade England, they don't suffer any of the turmoils because of those long-term wars. We also here have in England the fact that social change was possible without revolution. You want to put down here next to 9, and then we can flip, that social change came from social reform, not social upheaval. Social change came from social reform, not social upheaval. Now, this is not to say that, the revolutionary poo does not nearly hit the revolutionary fan on a couple of occasions. But the English government, from time to time, is going to be very proactive and will do things to kind of chill out this situation. So, social change will come through the government, not because there's a revolution, but because there's legislative change going on.